Hello, everybody, and welcome to Virtual Bourbon. My name is Steve Akley, and we have a fun event tonight. This is really a special one. I can't stress this enough that the Michters event is something that I've personally been looking forward to. Some 1977 Michters distilled by the great Dick Stoll. So you're talking about really in his prime there, making whiskey, and should be fun to give this one a taste. And of course, we're comparing this to some modern day whiskey, so should be fun to see if we can guess. As always, that's always a fun component to this. So with that, I'll turn it over to our host for the evenings, who says he's got more history for this one than any other one that he's ever had. So, Mr. Wes Hardin. Hey, Wes, how you doing, man?
Hey, Steve, how's it going?
Good, good. So,
all right, so welcome everyone. We have a couple of new people to the event. So before we get started, I want to do a couple of things. One, there is a lot of history, so we're not going to start out drinking yet. But what I would ask, if you have not, and this is probably something we need to do going forward, especially with the Dusty sample, is let's go ahead and pour those samples, and especially the Dusty, which you won't know which one it is. But let's let
So
those let's let those air out so we can have a more effective nose and so forth. So if you get a chance and haven't yet, let's air those out and let those sit for a little bit. For anybody new that hasn't been on the events before, I want to remind you of a couple things. At the end of the event, we go through and we do a poll for everyone, and we will ask you your personal favorite and which one of the samples you think is the Dusty. Along the way, we're going to stop at certain points, and we're going to nose and taste samples blindly. We're not going to reveal until the very end. So along the way, jump in with any kind of nosing notes, tasting notes, finish notes, and so forth. But please hold your opinion on which one you think is the Dusty till the end. What we don't want to do is skew anyone else's opinion. It's kind of a fun thing we do at the end is we vote. So just to remind everyone, you have two samples. One of the samples is a current Michters US1 bourbon. It's 91.4% proof. That's everyday off the shelfer. This particular bottle is from this year, 2022. So it's about as fresh as it gets. And one of the samples is the 1977 Dusty. It's an 86 proofer, and it's from their canal boat decanter. And we'll talk about some of that as we go. So we're probably going to, there's a lot of history. I'm probably going to break this up into probably 4 sessions. We usually do it in 3, but at some point I'll need to catch my breath and take a drink. So,
hey, Wes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are these white A and B labels? I'm making sure I got the right ones.
Yep, you got it, my man.
All right. Thank you.
Someone somewhere probably has a 2 on theirs instead of a B, but it's a, there you go. I knew somebody had the magic. That one is that's a magic bottle, by the way. You win. I'm sorry, not so magic. Bob got a 2 as well. So
how does this even happen? And how does it happen if you know about it? Why didn't you just pen over it and make it?
I didn't realize it till the end, and then it was like at some point, at some point, like A is 1 and 1 is A.
Sure.
So yeah. So there's a couple of people got the magic B bottles, so or number 2 bottles. Enjoy that. All right, so we're going to talk through some Michter's history. It's pretty crazy, pretty eventful, and let's get through it. So founded in 1753 by John Schenck. So that last name should be familiar, and it should resonate with something that's going on today. But John Schenck originated in 1753 in Schaeffertown, Pennsylvania. He was a Swiss Mennonite farmer. So again, it's the same. You get back into the 17 and 1800s, it's the same story, different verse. Someone who owns a farm, owns farmland, grows crops, has excess grains, decides to start distilling. So nothing really special there. Just in this particular case, he was the originator of this distillery and what ends up being this brand. What's odd is in the same year, he actually filed a patent for a grist mill located on Schnitzel Creek. So he actually had a grist mill, and then he founded this brand of this company. Originally, it was just produced as a rye, so it was not originally a corn-based product. It was a rye. When you get into the East Coast, you get in Pennsylvania, Maryland, even parts of Virginia. You get into some of those colder climates, and you get out of some of the humidity, and you get into different, you get into different areas. And when you further north you get, rye, it's a better environment for rye, and that's was the big product then. So The original product was a rye. He grew the grain on his farm, just like everyone else did. And that was pretty common for pre-industrialization farmers, especially on the East Coast. That period's whiskey, so they say that period's whiskey was literally nothing like today's, even in a rye whiskey. It wasn't aged at all, so basically it's rye moonshine, for lack of better terms. And it was distilled at around 20 proof. The early stuff was like super low distillation. You can imagine it was probably pretty rudimentary back in the mid to late 1700s. But yeah, it was a rye-based non-aged whiskey is what it was. When the Revolutionary War broke out, it's pretty well documented that George Washington not only visited that distillery, but he purchased a whiskey supply, and he used that supply and gave it to his men that were bunkered at Valley Forge during the long winter that they waited out at Valley Forge. So the Michters brand, or the Michters company, for lack of better terms, has its origins all the way back to George Washington. And it's pretty interesting that he went to the distillery.
Oh, heck yeah, he's buying allocated product for his troops. You got to love the guy. He's buying shanks for him.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly
come on.
right. So he's, it's pretty well documented that, they were not clothed very well. They were kind of a ragtag group. And so one of the ways he helped to get them through the winter is, if you're feeling cold, one of the things you can do is pound down some whiskey, and it'll warm you right up. So that's what he did. He went to the distillery, purchased the whiskey, and helped keep his men, I guess, not only to some degree lively and spirited, literally, but kept them warm during the winter. Just as a kind of an interesting note, this is, today we think of a distillery can be as big as Buffalo Trace, or as small as like a Neely family distillery or a small craft distillery. But back then, distilleries were literally, if you owned a farm and you actually distilled, that that gets counted at some point as a distillery. But Pennsylvania in the early 1800s had over 3,000 functioning distilleries, and most all of them were all only distilling rye whiskey. So you get into the 1800s, there's still predominantly rye whiskey people. Shink's Distillery continued to distill and sell the rye whiskey until 1827. And the company was passed down to John Shink's son-in-law, Rudolph Meyer, the third, technically, if you really need to know that. He owned the company, but he did not run the operation. So he was a true business owner that, it was not common in the time. Most of the time back then, the person who owned the distillery or the company also served as at least a master head distiller, or they were the head sales guy or whatever. He didn't run the operation itself. That responsibility came down to a guy named John Kratzer. So between John Kratzer, Rudolph Meyer, they owned and operated the Shink's Distillery, is what it really was. And they did that until 1860, and it was sold to a man named Abraham Bomberger. So we've already mentioned two names that here in the last 5 to 7 years have started to come back into prominence. Their current labels for whiskey release by Michters today. So there's a Bomberger and there's a Shink's. So if you see any of that on the shelves, that's obviously a Michters product today, but the origins go all the way back to the company before it was ever even known or remotely thought of to be Michters. The company was originally Shink's, then it was Bomberger's, and then Michters comes on later in life. So it's just kind of, if you don't dig into the history, I know there's people in the whiskey world, and they say, what is this Shink's and what is this Bomberger's and what are those labels? Well, if you dig into it, what you find out is they actually existed before Michters ever did. So Michters here recently has paid homage to its origins, basically, is what it amounts to. And Mr. Shink and Mr. Bomberger paved the way to what's Michters today. So if you go back in time, those were the two original guys. So when you see those on the shelves, those are just labels that pay homage to the founders of the company, is what it amounts to. So they owned and operated until 1860, sold to Bomberger. It was Bomberger that was thought to have started distilling corn-based whiskey to go along with the traditional rye. So he kind of expanded out, started procuring corn. So he had a corn whiskey, had a rye whiskey. Ultimately, we know down the line, you marry those two together and you've got a bourbon, you've got an American whiskey, mix of the two, depending on what the mash bill would be. He also began aging both in charred barrels, ultimately setting the stage for the bourbon production. So previously, all of the rye whiskey was unaged. He not only started aging the rye whiskey in charred barrels, and he obviously started doing corn whiskey in charred barrels. So that was, sometime after 1860, they got into that, to the aging in charred barrels type of thing. 1 year later, he actually changed the name of the distillery to Baumburger. So in 1861, the distillery went from Shinks to Baumburgers. It was named the Baumburger Distillery. Interesting piece of information. Baumburger's mother was a Shink. So if you really dig back into it, it's always kind of been in that Shinks and Baumburger family since early on. So that was just a piece of interesting information that came up. So it's kind of just, through marriage, it was still a family owned company. Baumburger expanded operations. He was able to produce more whiskey, and he was trying to move it from like a farm distillery to more legitimate commercial distillery. And in 1866, he married and he had 2 sons. In 1875, the distillery was so large at full capacity, he could no longer run it with just family members. So up until 1875, the distillery did not employ anyone that wasn't part of the family. So it was still a small operation, him, his wife, the kids, but they got to the point where they were producing so much, the demand was getting larger, and they hired their first help from outside the family. They hired from the community, and thus creating jobs in this small local community. So that's kind of back then in 1875, that was probably a pretty big deal that took them from that was really probably what took them from the farm distillery into more of a commercial. When his sons came of age, he changed the name of the distillery to the Abraham Baumburger and Sons Distillery. So they just added basically the sons on the end of it. He died in 1904, and his 2 sons, Horst, not Horst, but Horst, Horst and Samuel took over. They renamed the distillery H.H. Baumburger. So it kind of went through just basically a couple of twists of names, but at the end of the day, it's still a Baumburger family. Between the 2 brothers, it's pretty well documented that Horst was by far the alpha male between the 2, and he made all the business decisions and ran the company. On paper, they both owned it, but he was the person that made all the decisions, and his brother kind of just fell in line and did what he wanted. In 1915, Horst fell ill at the age of 48 with a stroke and Parkinson's, which was interesting to me, and I've never completed any research on Parkinson's, but I had no idea that was a definable condition in 1915. So I don't know if that's if that's in a later assumption based on his symptoms. They kind of tied it later on to, oh, that was Parkinson's, but at the time they didn't know it was Parkinson's. But the research I did said that he had A, a stroke, and B, had Parkinson's. He was confined to a wheelchair, so that kind of makes sense. I think the combination of the stroke and whatever symptoms that ultimately suggested he had Parkinson's confined him to a wheelchair, but it didn't stop him from maintaining full control of the business. So even after he had his health issues, he literally kept running the distillery and kind of pushing it forward. They continued running the distillery, high volume production for those times, all the way up until Prohibition. So Prohibition begins in 1920. The distillery was forced to shut down. And then just a couple of months later, after the distillery shut down, Horst passed away from his illness. So, there's always that when you have people, it doesn't have to be of age, but usually some people that are of age and they've worked in a certain area for their life, and that becomes their livelihood, and they either retire or they sell their company or whatever. You hear of a lot of people that not long after that, they mysteriously get sick or they pass away or whatever the case is. It sounds like, he already was in bad health, but once the distillery was shut down due to Prohibition, he literally passed away from his illnesses a few months later. So just kind of an interesting piece there. Baumburgers was not allowed to distill during Prohibition, but it's suspected that there was a periodic illegal distilling that took place as part of a multi-level police and government bootlegging operation directly tied to George Remus. So it's pretty well documented that during Prohibition, not only was Remus getting a ton of bourbon out of Kentucky, but he had ties to Pennsylvania distilling, and there were
Uh-oh. Wes froze up. Every once in a while
three
this happens.
distilleries that was suggested. There were eyewitnesses that stating there were. Are you there? Sorry.
Yeah, you froze up for a minute there, but yeah, you're good now.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm sorry about that. Let me. So
You were talking about Remus. You were talking about Remus.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, it's pretty well documented. He was getting, he was buying and stealing and bootlegging whiskey from everywhere, but predominantly he was getting quite a large amount from Pennsylvania as well. There were some eyewitness accounts throughout the years of Prohibition that suggested that, early in the morning and late at night under the cover of dark, that this Baumberger's distillery would have the odd and end truck leaving and moving, and there were accounts of lights on at times and things of that nature. So I think it's probably pretty safe to say that with enough police and local people, especially in a small community like that, it's not that many people you have to get into the pockets of to be able to run that operation without much or little fear from government kicking in. Interesting note, the day before Prohibition in Pennsylvania began, the locals lined up for 2.5 miles to fill their jugs and bottles before the distillery shut down. So I would say that's probably a pretty common theme. If you were to dig into the history, a lot of local, smaller distilleries that obviously weren't able to produce during Prohibition, but yeah, it's pretty interesting that people lined up for 2.5 miles. So like, that's if you take a line of people that would fill 2.5 miles, it's got to be the entire town and surrounding area. Back in those days, it's just it's pretty interesting. When they sold all their stocks and the stocks emptied, Baumberger sold the distillery to a local farmer named Ephraim Sechrist. So I think a lot of companies they didn't get their medicinal license. They could not legally distill anymore, and once all their aged stock was either raided by the feds or they sold it off, most everyone shut down or at the minimum sold the land and the property to an investor, a farmer, or whatever the case may be. It's also suspected, and this kind of goes back to what we talked about, that during Prohibition, as the locals were allowed to come in and kind of fill some of their jugs with this illegal distilling, their payment to the distillery for being allowed to do this, other than money, was they served as sentries to watch out for any police and government outsiders, specifically Prohibition agents who arrived in town. I actually found an article written by a granddaughter of a local saying that they had family stories passed down through the years that her grandfather had a regular shift that a couple of days a week he was a undercover watchman, and he would hide out in the local wooded area watching for the Prohibition agents, anybody in suits, the whole 9 yards, and his reward for that is being able to have the right to pay for illegal whiskey in a time where whiskey wasn't allowed. So I would say that was another thing that probably happened pretty commonly during Prohibition and in different areas for sure. And then, we're going to take a break after this one piece of information. After Prohibition, the Baumberger distillery actually started back up post-production pretty slowly. And by 1942, Sechrist sold the land and the distillery to a guy named Lewis Foreman. So we're going to take a break because the story gets really weird from here for a few years. I'm actually going to tell you two separate stories because pieces of both have been corroborated and pieces of both are suspect. So we're going to talk about both of them, and it's kind of this is a weird history that we're going to get into. But until then, let's take a break here and let's go to sample A. And let's nose this guy and discuss what we've got here.
It's pretty bold on the nose. It's sweet and spicy. What else is anybody else getting?
Nondescript caramel dessert.
Nondescript caramel dessert.
Something with a lot of caramel on it.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, we get a little cocoa.
Cocoa. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, a little brown sugar, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like it.
Bill
I
likes
like it. There it is right there. Kind of get like a sweet, fruity, sugary nose.
Or like a caramel creme brulee.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Kind of the scorched sugar on top. Yeah. All right, let's taste it.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really good. Sweet, caramely. Kind of spicy on the back and just sticks around.
Kind of like a spice cake with the caramel and the spicy and all that.
Yeah, that's really nice. What else? Let's go to our two Jasons. Jason W first.
The back end, I'm getting a little like chocolate, a little toast.
Mhm.
So it's the caramel. It's nice.
Yeah. Jason S.
Getting like a dark honey.
Mm-hmm.
Then kind of lightens up, and then the spice hits after the sweetness kind of goes away.
Yep. Yeah. All right, let's talk to the Maces. Patriarch first. Mr. Kent Mace.
I'm getting a little bit of cinnamon,
Mhm.
not just cinnamon, but like coffee cake.
Coffee cake. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Jump down to Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just all like describing different desserts. I don't know anything different to add. I liked the description of like creme brulee, I guess, because it does have a little bit of a, not like a smokiness, but like really captured. I mean, I thought like it's very dark. The same thing with like the dark honey, but yeah, I think I agree with all of the different dessert assessments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Round out our Maces with Nate. Nate.
Well, on the nose, I was thinking like big red chewing gum.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've just had that cinnamon in my mind. So that's kind of what I pulled from it.
Okay. Okay. Let's go two more. We'll go to Mike Gascamp. And we'll save some for the.
He's the reigning champ too, I think.
Oh yeah, Mike.
Oh no, that record's long gone. I've been in Wyoming too much. I missed too many of these. The only thing different that I kind of got a little on the back of the palate was like Redskin peanut hull.
Okay.
Not in a bad way, but just kind of like that dusty peanut shell, kind of a little salty, kind of going on.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm just craving Redskin peanuts. I don't know.
Okay. We'll go one more again. We'll mix it up. Ask some other folks on the next one, but when we get to B. But let's talk to the Murph right now.
Yeah. So my very first taste, I caught some kind of a dark red stone fruit, either a dark cherry or a very ripe plum, and then it disappeared, and I can't get it back.
Okay.
But it was just very brief, right at the front. Other than that, I'm the same thing everyone else is.
Yeah, I had that too, Brian. To me on the front, it was a little fruitier than I think some other people got, but I did get that as well.
Gotcha.
All right, anyone else want to chime in? We'll have more. We've got enough history here. We'll go to sample 2/B next, and then we'll kind of revisit them before the end game. So save a little if you can, and we'll go through it. So unless anyone else had anything, we're going to jump back into the history. So basically, we're post-prohibition, 1942. We'll go into what I call story one, and we'll go into story two. It'll explain itself, I think, as we go. So one account of what happened basically from the time that Secret sold the distillery was it was sold to Lewis Foreman. He already owned a spirits company, so his plans basically were to use that spirits company and be his own distributor, is what it really amounted to, for the whiskey coming out of that distillery. His ownership was short-lived because World War II hit. He was drafted to the military, so not long after buying it, his plans kind of went from rapid distribution to just maintaining the distillery, and then he went into the military. He sold the distillery when he went to the military because obviously he doesn't know A, if he's coming back, and B, when. Then he came back from the war in 1945. So there's a 3-year period where he was overseas in the military, but he did come back. And the owner that he sold the company to a local person who had also sold it while he was gone to Shenley, but also possibly a company called Penco. We'll talk, that'll come into account a little bit later. Penco as in Penco, Pennsylvania company would be the assumption. According to this account, in 1950, he purchased the distillery back, and at the purchase of the distillery, he changed the name to Michters. And how he came up with that name, and I think we've heard a similar thing before in past Dusty events, as he simply took the names of his 2 sons, Michael and Peter, and called it Michters. So that's basically how the term and the word Michters came up, was took the name of his sons, Michael and Peter, and came up with Michters. This is kind of one of those folklore kind of things. I don't know that it's ever been proven or not. Maybe Steve, because he's had conversations with Dick Stoll in the past, maybe he can corroborate it. But it's accounted that Shenley/Penco left behind a bourbon recipe that they were working on, and it was found by Foreman after he bought the distillery back. And in 1951, he actually hired a new master distiller, Charles Everett Beam, yes, Beam of the Beam family, to try and recreate this recipe. So this recipe became what was known as, and I still think they advertise certain branding today, Michter's Original Sour Mash Whiskey. I mean, that was kind of the branding they used with it. It was called a whiskey and not a bourbon or a rye because the mash bill was oddly 50% corn, so it wasn't the 51 to make it a bourbon. 38% rye, 12% malted barley. So the original sour mash whiskey, it's not a rye, it's not a bourbon because it lays right in the middle of that 50% corn. So that was rumored to be something that Shenley/Penco company had been deriving, and Charles Beam was the first one to distill that, according to the account. At the time, they couldn't distill it in column stills, the column stills that were made at that time frame in history, and so they reproduced them on the pot stills. So the sour mash whiskey came from pot stills, which still wasn't that uncommon for even after Prohibition. The Michter/Baumburger/Shinks has always been a smaller distillery. Even they were producing good amounts, but they weren't they were never as big as today's Old Forester, Maker's Mark. Probably their production wise and size wise, they were never a huge operation. Even like today's Michters is, they were always still not really a farm level, but they were kind of that next step up. So yeah, it was produced on the pot stills. It was during this time Foreman started renovating the distillery. and grounds. And he basically did that to repair the years of neglect during the ownership of Shinley and Penco. So there was a lot of neglect during that time. Everyone was starting back up for Prohibition because they were aging the whiskey in charred barrels. Whether it was used or new, they still had some aging to go, and so money was tight. So they kind of neglected it. So he had this envision of making this a destination distillery. And one of his primary workers on the project of restoring the outside grounds and the buildings and all of the maintenance types item was none other than a man named Dick Stoll. So he was initially a primary maintenance and grounds guy there at the distillery. It was kind of one of his first projects back in the day. And so that kind of takes it. That's one version of kind of how the ownership changed and who had the distillery from basically post-Prohibition up until really the early 1970s. So take that and put it on the back burner. And let's go into what I call story number 2. So we're going to pick back up right after Prohibition. There's a competing story. Abraham Bomberger's great granddaughter, her name is Yvonne Fowler. She wrote a piece. I call it a piece. It wasn't a book, but it was a piece. And this was detailing the history that her and the surviving members of her family could recall at the time. Her take and the family's take is that Foreman actually had nothing to do with that Schaefertown distillery, which was Schenck Bomberger's, that at some point does become Michters, until the 1970s. What she's saying is that after Prohibition, that this Penco company bought the distillery and owned it all the way up until the early 70s. She did say that Foreman did come up with the Michters name, but he did so in the 1940s, not the 70s. And there is some proof of this because I did find quite a few pictures of old jugs, the ceramic jugs and old-timey jugs of Michter's whiskey that had tax stamps showing 1942, 1948, 1950. So what she's stating is that he had some sort of involvement for sure, because she admits that he came up with the Michters name. But really, what's in dispute is who owned the distillery, is what it really amounts to. The odd thing about these decanters is the tax stamp doesn't say Schaeferstown. It says decanted and jugged in Sheridan, Pennsylvania. So it doesn't say it was distilled. So it's very possible that the whiskey definitely came from Schaeferstown, and it went to an offsite location and someone decanted, which would mean take it out of the original container and then jug it into these jugs. And obviously they have the tax stamp and so forth. What this really suggests is that maybe Penco wasn't necessarily the owners of the Michters distillery, and that Foreman actually did own the distillery, but they were more like that time's NDP. And so they purchased the whiskey, decanted it, jugged it, and sold that. There's also thoughts that Penco could have been linked to the Continental Distillery out of Philadelphia. And so this is her account. When I looked into it, I did a ton of research, and there's hardly any public information outside of people's accounts, just someone who talked to someone over the years, that a company called Penco distilled anything. The common theory is it was a non-distilled producer, and it could have been a DBA company under Shinley. So we do know for sure that after Prohibition, Shinley was one of the big 4 or 5 running around and buying up everybody, restarting distilleries that they had purchased and so forth. That is part of what the discussion is. It's also thought that Pinco actually bought the distillery in 1950 from Shenley, not Foreman, but Foreman was the president of Michters Distilling. So he was basically president of the company, but they were the owners. So he didn't own it at that time. He was president. So like I said, I dug into this. I've been working on this for a month, and there's no clear cut agreement. What is agreed is that Foreman did create the name of Michters based on his two sons' name. It definitely had an ownership of someone, whether it was Foreman, it was Pinco, it was Shenley. It had ownership. Once Foreman sold it, it was ownership past Prohibition all the way up until the late 60s, early 70s, which at that time Foreman did actually purchase it. So he either owned it from the time he got back from the war, or someone else owned it and he bought it back in the early 70s once the bourbon boom was starting to decline. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about any of that. It was kind of a crazy deep dive research that went into that, but it's just goes to show you that as much as we love the history, even to some degree, you get to anything prior to the
Right.
50s, 60s. It's just a lot of undocumented.
It's crazy to think, Wes, that the easier history to uncover, very clear, is your stuff from the 1700s, the 1800s, and the stuff in the post-prohibition is tough to figure out. That's pretty wild, because you look at it seems so modern compared to some of that old stuff.
Yeah, to me, it's a byproduct of what the big five created after Prohibition, when they went through and bought everybody up, basically. And I say everybody, it's not all inclusive, but for the most part, they bought everyone up. And that started this huge 40-year chain reaction, probably 50-year chain reaction of distilleries and brands buying, selling, changing hands, moving around. I mean, if you go through and take a look at all of the labels that Heaven Hill owns, there's a large amount of labels. Obviously, the Luxco owns. There's a large amount of labels that Willet owns. And Willet meaning KBD, because they operated under that for years. There's so many labels on there that if you just saw a dusty bottle of a certain brand, you would never be able to initially say, "Oh man, that was from Heaven Hill owned that label." But you have to really do the digging. They own it now, but they didn't own it back then. So it's just it just goes to show you that the big five, in some ways, probably saved bourbon after Prohibition by ensuring that production kept going, and they built these big distilleries for the rebirth. But in some way, they kind of muddied a lot of the history with all these labels and distilleries and brands and everything else shooting all over the place. But it's interesting. My guess is, like everything else, there's a truth in the middle. The one thing that I do know for sure, that Pinco company, there's just not a lot out there on it. The most common thing that I've seen is probably more closely tied to Continental than Shenley. So my guess is they probably were the owners, and the Foreman guy was probably the president of the company, and they were kind of just owners in a sense of financial owners, and not out there. Now there were Pinco products during that time, so it was definitely some sort of company of some sort. I just don't think they actually were a distilling company. I think they probably were more of marketing and label creation type of thing. So I did find a lot of pictures of old Pinco like glass pictures, and some old jugs which looked exactly like the old jugs of Michters. So there's definitely something there. I just think the full ownership is a little bit of a crazy trail through the years. But what we do know is that Michters was founded by Foreman, and it was the name was brought to light from his two sons, basically. And there's a little bit of mystery who owned the company from post-Prohibition to really the early 70s is kind of what it amounts to. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and keep going. Believe it or not, we're not even halfway there. So.
Hey, Wes, before you go any further,
yeah,
wouldn't it make sense that they were trying to hide money and
I think so.
Throw everybody off on who owned it?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of that. I think a lot of it may be, it may have been a way to try to avoid some of the taxation possibly. You know, who owns it, who the hell knows. There's some information later on that gets into a little bit of that, which I think kind of sheds a little bit of light into it. So I don't think there's a smoking gun. I think there's smoking guns. It's a little bit of each, but the reality of it is, I think the Pinco company came up too many times. There was too many picture evidence to say that it wasn't involved at all. So I think story one and story two, the truth is somewhere between a mesh of those, I guess.
Probably, yeah.
So everything from here on out is not mixed into a story one, a story two. It's kind of picking up the story, as it were. There's just that little middle area that's kind of weird. So I wanted to just give both views, and people can take from it what they need to. From the 60s to the 80s, Foreman did own the company. The date is not quite exactly sure. They think it's around 74. We'll get into that. But basically, Foreman was involved, at least from the standpoint of using his liquor wholesale business to distribute Michter's whiskey. So whether he owned it prior to the early 70s, they were working with him through the distribution side at the minimum. And maybe that's where some of the story 1 and 2 gets a little weird. But he definitely was at the forefront of being their top wholesaler, basically, is what it amounts to. He started bottling Michters in white china jugs. And what he realized was people were mainly buying these for gifts. And so he decided to move more product to the mainstream consumer. So, back then the people are buying these for gifts, or maybe that day and time's whiskey nerds type of thing. They're cool whiskey jugs, different than glass bottles, which are prominent, obviously, in that time frame. So he decided, I'm going to start bottling it in mass in glass bottles, and then still have my little gift business with the jugs on the side. So Michter started bottling in glass. Most of these are only 86 proof. What we're drinking tonight is 86 proof. There were some at 101 proof. Now, this is a very interesting piece of information. I think I've seen one time, not in person, but I think I've seen one on one of the Facebook pages, but I can't find it. I went and looked for it again. As we know, 101 proof is pretty distinct. There's typically about, especially back in those days, only one company that made 101 proof on the regular. And we know who that is. That was, at that time, that would have been Ojo Distillery, which ends up being Wild Turkey. But they did have some at 101 proof. It's rumored that the 101 proof were excess Wild Turkey contract distillation that Wild Turkey ended up not purchasing. So again, we're talking late 60s and 70s. What we do know for sure is in that same time frame, Wild Turkey had a special New York bottling. It's clear on the label that it just says it was distilled in Kentucky, but it says bottled in New York, which there's no bottling facility in New York. And so Wild Turkey, like everyone else, or that distillery wasn't Wild Turkey at the time, did some weird things with contract distilling for excess. They did some weird things with labeling and bottling. This was the only 101 proof that was ever bottled under Michters at the time. It was a relatively small amount, and it just, the rumor is that it's Wild Turkey contract distillation that they end up not buying because the bourbon boom started to bust, and they had more than their own distillate, and they basically canceled the order, for lack of better terms. So they had all this all this bottled up at 101, and they released it as Michters. That's the rumor. Not sure if it's true. Sorry, lost my spot. So as the whiskey glut of the 70s continued to grow, Pinco struggled financially due to unsold stocks, but mostly onto unpaid debts. So this is where some of that ownership and some of that weird stuff comes into play. So they had a ton of unpaid debts. Rumor is some of that was unpaid taxes. I think that's where some of that shell company moving money around and things happen. And so in 74, Foreman reached out to multiple businessmen in the local area, and they end up purchasing the distillery out of foreclosure. So in 74, Michter's distillery was in foreclosure. They couldn't pay the parent company. So this is where, when you go back to those story 1s and 2, it's fairly commonly documented, at least in 74, that Pinco, in partnership with Foreman, owned the distillery. So it's part of that whole weird history thing. But they sold it. The local businessman renamed it Michters Distillery Inc. from Michters Distillery. And they also petitioned the distillery to be added to the National Register of Historic Places. So they did this for a specific reason we'll get into later. As part of this petition, they were allowed to sell whiskey directly at the distillery. And at that time, that was kind of a first, at least in Pennsylvania for sure. We know in Kentucky that didn't happen until many years later. But yeah, they were one of the first to actually be able to sell bottles of whiskey at the distillery, like like we do today. You go to a gift shop, pick up a bottle, and you get on with life. So part of their National Historic Registry allowed them the license in Pennsylvania to sell bottles directly out of the distillery.
Yeah.
So that vision to come up with kind of a destination type of distillery was starting to kind of, they got past the legal portion of it, so they started getting into.
They actually had an operational distillery. I don't know if you have that in your notes, Wes, that was for visitors.
Yep.
So like a visitor center with a working still where they were making some whiskey. But again, the main production was not done there. But that was, again, things that we're seeing today were being done, in the 70s by Michters, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in here for sure. So again, like I said, this is an incredible amount of history that came out of this thing. So they've got their petition. The local guys own it. At this time, Vendome built 2 operational pot stills to put on public display as models of what the early distillery equipment looked like. After a few years, the display was finished, and then one of these was sold to Lewis Foreman. So even after he sold the distillery, he still had a hand in kind of what was going on there. It doesn't really say whether it was as a consultant, as a operational guy, as a president, but it sounds like he and Pinco kind of got out from under some debt, but he's still involved in the whole thing. And so one of these was sold to him. He moved it to Michters, and they used it to what Steve was talking about. They used that pot still to produce whiskey only for their public tours. So that particular, and this pot still will come up later in the story as well. It was there, and at that time they were into column still like everyone else because they were pretty big production. They used that big pot still only for the whiskey they sold at the distillery as part of the tour. So it was a totally different product than what they had out for the masses. During the late 70s and 80s, Michters was looking for other avenues to get rid of aged whiskey. And like everyone else, they got on the decanter train. So they began to release a series of decanters with a lot of different American images. That was pretty common. I think Beam, you think of American images, it's not only landmarks, but it's people. I mean, there was a Rocky Marciano Beam decanter. There's a Mount Rushmore decanter. There's all these different Americana type things. Michters had colonial settlers, Liberty Bell, this canal boat that we're drinking from tonight. A Contessa Toga, I think is how you pronounce it. Conestoga wagon. There's all kinds of Americana decanters. And around this same time, the King Tutankhamun exhibit started making its way around America, which I didn't even know was a thing. But evidently, there was an exhibit that traveled out of Egypt and traveled the world back in this time frame. It was a King Tutankhamun exhibit, and it started making its way to the U.S. And so Michters released a line of American Egypt decanters. There's a King Tut, there's a Queen Selleck, there's a Nefertiti, and there was a Cleopatra. So the King Tut is probably one of the most common and kind of sought after Michters decanters. It was one of the first ones I ever saw. It's literally a little gold head of King Tut. I think at one time they even had them as so big they were like a half gallon size, and they obviously had the 700 and 750 milliliter. But they went crazy with this whole decanter thing and started producing not only the Americana stuff, but the King Tutankhamun. And in 1980, they wanted to commemorate their induction into the National Historic Landmark. And part of this plan was they created 23 karat gold gilded decanters in the shape of that original pot still. So that pot still that they used to make whiskey for their tours, their plan was to make 23 karat gold gilded decanters. And back in 1980, they sold them for $500 a piece.
Wow.
So you think about today, $500, releases, you're talking Whistle Pig, you're talking Booker's Rye, you're talking about all these things. This is 1980. I have no idea what, I know Steve's looked this up before. I don't know what $500 in 1980 equals today. I'm guessing $1,200, $1,500, $2,000. I have no idea what it is.
Yeah, we'll have to see. So I'll check it out.
All right. So they released 2,000 of these, but only 893 sold. And part of their slogan, which is the dumbest slogan I've ever, in hindsight, we could say this because we didn't own the company and we weren't into whiskey.
$1,800, by the way.
$1,800. There you go. So for the equivalent of $1,800 a pop today, 500 back then, part of their slogan was they said that of the 2,000 that they produced, any of those that were not sold by the end of the day on June 22nd, which was the anniversary of their induction into the deal, the public could come to the distillery and smash the remaining leftover full decanters. So at 6:30 p.m., their PR move backfire. So the idea was, let's put this stress on the people. If they don't rush out and the FOMO doesn't hit, it's going to hit. We'll rush out. They're going to buy every one of these things because who wants to see them smashed, right? I got to get one for it smashed. But backfire. They sold not even half. They sold 893 of the 2,000, and they owned up to what they said. And at 6:30 p.m., spectators and locals showed up and helped smash over 1,000 of these full decanters.
That's crazy.
Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable.
I never heard that story before.
Never heard that one?
That's a great story. Yeah.
That is a cool story, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. I'm not going to take a break. We're going to take a break. We're going to get into sample 2/B.
Okay.
Whichever one is on your dial. All right, where are you guys getting here?
So this one's right when you cut into a fresh apple.
All right, fresh
Yeah,
apple.
that's good.
Yeah. Granny Smith peel.
Yeah.
Granny Smith peel.
I like it. Bill dropped off the call, so we can all say that now. Get it out of your system. Say it now before he dials back in. Yeah. I think Jason hit the nail on the head, though. I like that. Fresh cut apple.
Fresh cut apple.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks for ruining for us, Jason.
Tony Frun. We
I
haven't
meant
heard from you
mango.
yet,
I
sir.
meant mango.
Let's hear from Tony. I haven't heard from Tony yet.
Yeah, this one was a lot stronger and brighter on the nose.
Okay.
It kind of smells similar, a little bit more pronounced. I get some of that, I guess, kind of that apple, more of a lemon citrus to me.
Okay. I have a fairly pronounced note, but I'm going to save it until everyone else goes because I want to see if anybody else picks up on it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Seems kind of spicier up front and sweeter at the back, different than normal. Kind of apple pie when they put the caramel on there, you get sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the Robinsons? What do you guys think?
I can't get past the apple now.
Mm-hmm.
There's something else there, but I can't identify it.
Yeah, kind of, I'm with Tony, sort of a lemony or maybe even like rhubarb or something, kind of a tart nose. It's apple pie, but I don't get the caramel as much, but it's good smell. Good
Yeah,
nose.
it's tart. It's not the sweet apple pie.
It's good nose.
Bill, you're back on. What do you think?
I like it. My wife's getting ready to print, so I'm going to mute here in a minute. But yeah, the first one had more of a bright nose to it, and on the palate, and this one it's not tart, but it's not sweet. But it's more tart than sweet.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I tell you, the thing that hits. Anybody else want to go real quick, and then I'll give mine just for the hell of it.
I'm getting a little hint of anise or licorice in underneath that apple too.
Okay.
Got to check it with Tom too. Tom, what do you got, man?
Well, I was getting a little pie crust, but yeah.
I can, after several passes, I get a little bit.
What about the palate, the taste there? What do you guys think?
I mean, I get a spice again that kind of lingers on the center of the palate, kind of on the tongue, concentrated. So
it has a weird feeling of being both watery and oily at the same time.
Yeah.
Like there's a heavy, the spice has a heaviness to it, but the sweetness is just watery and just kind of just goes and then is gone.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah, the finish kind of dries out.
I told the boys this is the white wine version of bourbon.
What version?
The white wine.
White wine version of
It's a dry wine.
Okay. I can see that.
The first one had some hang time on the palate, stuck around for quite a while for me, and this one goes away pretty quickly. Stick around.
Anyone else? And we'll jump into some more of this fine history we got. All right. Steve, you ready to move on?
Yes, sir.
Believe it or not, we're about halfway there. So in 1972, we talked about Charles Beam earlier, his introduction into the company around the 50s. In 72, he had to retire due to health issues. But over the years, he had been grooming his replacement, the head of maintenance, none other than Dick Stoll. So Dick had worked his way up through the years, started, and this is a very common theme, not only in yesteryear distillery world, but even in today's world. There's still a lot of the big companies still, they go through and they're looking for the guy or the gal with the chemical engineering degree, and it's all science and things of that nature. But a lot of the craft distilleries, some of those have those people, but some of the head and master distillers in today's distilleries are people that came from the ground up and learned all of the different aspects of the business. They were general laborers. They worked in maintenance. They worked in bottling. They worked in shipping. They worked in quality. Obviously, they worked in distilling. So it's a pretty common theme, especially in yesteryear, but even so today. But through the years, he worked his way up from an entry laborer all the way to head distiller, and then obviously a master distiller later on. During his career, he would distill from Michters. He actually contract distilled to Wild Turkey, so that kind of corroborates a little bit of that 101 thing we talked about earlier. And I think for the real bourbon geeks, and I'll never be lucky enough to drink it, but he was the distiller for all the contracted A.H. Hirsch bourbon, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So and obviously that bourbon was such an incredible bourbon by some of the considered by some of the well-known bourbon reviewers and authors. And Chuck Cowdery wrote the book entitled "The Best Bourbon You'll Ever Taste," or You'll Never Taste. Sorry. So it was a huge hit, at least from standpoint of consumers and reviewers and critics and so forth. He was the first distiller to utilize both pot and column stills at the same time.
Yep.
He did it into the early 80s. So that's he was the first one to do it. That was something that there were people that were good on the pot, there were people that were good on the column, there were people that in their career transitioned from one to the other. He flat out used them both at the same time, which is pretty interesting if you think about it.
Yeah,
He was also,
and again, talking to him about that, he always had what we would probably call an assistant distiller, but for them, that person who operated the column was known as the operator.
Okay.
Just an operator. The distiller or master distiller was the person that worked the pot.
He was the artist,
because
right?
They're the artists. They're making the cuts and all those things. So yes. Very interesting approach. And again, used very infrequently today, but when you see it, it's like, man, I bet you they're making some good whiskey. So saw some of that actually recently at Dancing Goat. They got one of those setups there. They got like 4 stills, but one of their setups is that. So the old Michters setup.
That's cool.
Yeah.
He was a staunch supporter, like refused to do it. He was a staunch supporter in only distilling in the spring and the fall and never distilling in the summer. He was absolutely convinced that distilling in the summer created a bad whiskey. And some of the whiskey that he created, it's hard to argue with anything he said. But if you think about it, not that distilleries today don't distill in the summer, but distilleries don't do their shutdowns in the spring and the fall by any means. They do it, in the summer for the most part. I think part of that is probably relief for the workers and give them some time off in the terrible heat and humidity time frame. But I think the other part of it is there's probably some science behind, especially in this. Pennsylvania may be a little bit different. It still gets hot and humid there. July in the summer months, he just flat out wouldn't distill in the summer months. It was spring and fall. Now that being said, the heyday of his distilling was also a downturn in the industry. So it wasn't hard to meet volumes and things of that nature. So you probably had a little bit of luxury to be able to do that. And the bean counters probably didn't get after him, but he was a believer just from a quality standpoint. Don't distill in the summer, you're going to get an inferior whiskey. So he didn't. He absolutely didn't. Once their column still was in operation, for a while he did use both back and forth. The pot still was ultimately intended to be bottled and sold for the public only, which we talked about if you came for a tour. But into the mid 80s, that tour pot still distillation product became their major source of income. So the industry had kind of absolutely crashed in the 80s. And they weren't producing or selling a ton off the column still. It was mainly, locals and very similar to what is a very similar process to what happens with craft distilleries. So craft distilleries start with more localized sales. Local people come in. Let's take Neely's. Local people like Neely's. They come in for more. Word gets around, and their business starts with more localized plant tour sales, things of that nature, and they're not big into distribution. These guys went the opposite way, where they went from total distribution to the bourbon industries and total free fall. But they kept the lights on and running, and the big part of their income were tours and people, locals just coming to the distillery and buying the whiskey straight there, and they bought the pot still whiskey. So into the mid 80s, the big source of income was from this pot still. In 83, the distillery had to file for bankruptcy. As part of the process, the bank held the bonds to all the warehoused aged whiskey at the site, and they had a third-party company watching over it. And I put that in there because it's going to come into play later. Production eventually stopped in 89, and the shutdown of the entire operation came soon after. One of the last customers who had paid inventory in the warehouses was A.H. Hirsch. So he had contracted 800 barrels of bourbon to be distilled and aged at Michters. And instead of cashing in and collecting them around 8 years, he kept them there at Michters in the warehouse. He kept them there until the absolute last moment before the company totally went under and shut down. And he kept them there until he could pull them out at the last moment. And what's odd is he actually personally never collected that whiskey. Right at the very end, right before it was time to pull it all out, he sold it all to a man named Gordon Hugh in 1989. So Gordon picked up the barrels and immediately shipped them to Ohio. Of the 800 barrels, 550 of them were vatted in stainless tanks, and the remaining 250 were sent to Lawrenceburg, Kentucky to continue aging. They didn't go to Wild Turkey. They went to none other than Hoffman Distillery. Hoffman Distillery, and I don't want to give too much away because Hoffman, we have a Hoffman Dusty that we're going to do here towards the end of the year. So I'll tell that entire story then. But what I'll say is Hoffman Distillery was a temporary home for none other than Julian Van Winkle once he left as the Weller. So all of that kind of ties in. On Valentine's Day in 1990, Dick Stoll received a phone call and it said immediately shut down everything and tell everyone to go home. So after 230 years, that distillery was permanently shut down. So if you think about it, this wasn't, there's a lot of really old companies that have always had one owner or one group of owners or a family of owners, but over time a distillery is burned down and they built it back up, or they ran out of capacity and shuttered an aging distillery and built a new one. Michters / Bomberger / Shinks were in the same distillery, same location for 230 years. Pretty unprecedented if you think about it. Dick Stoll went to work in the concrete business for a few years before he retired, but his time there wasn't done for sure. He was called back by the bank who owned all the inventory and order. So it was foreclosed on. The bank owned everything. They called him back to inventory all the equipment, the whiskey, and the buildings. And this comes into play in a minute as well. So again, like we said, that distillery was the oldest functioning distillery in the U.S. for over 2 centuries. Like the history there is incredible. The U.S. Department of the Interior, they actually revoked the Michters landmark status in 1997. So that property in 1997 was no longer on the register as a historic landmark, which was pretty odd. After shutting down, which is normal, same thing happened at Old Taylor Distillery, and I'm sure an unlimited amount of others. Locals started raiding the distillery, raided the property. What they didn't know until they broke in is that literally when they said shut down, close the doors, everyone go home, they left. The warehouse whiskey was a different scenario, but what wasn't inventoried and counted on were the full cases and bottles in the jug house and the what was their version of the gift shop, basically. So the locals came in and raided that place, absolutely stole everything they could out of the gift shop and the jug house. There were articles, and I actually pulled up a couple. There's articles in local papers that the little country road outside the distillery was littered with smashed decanters and bottles where people would just come in, grab what they wanted, start drinking it on the way home. And they would throw the empties and smash them. And it was an absolute madhouse. There were stories. So people some of the locals started reporting this to the federal government, but they really didn't do anything about it. They evidently tried to hunt down the lien owner on the property, but his name was Ted Berry, but he didn't do anything about it, and they just kind of gave up. Nobody really gave a shit about whiskey at that time, and they didn't care about old distilleries and so forth. After visits to the distillery, there was little or no paper trail stating if the whiskey had taxes paid on it. And basically it was decided anything left there couldn't be sold. So after 2 years of this government review and looking at the whiskey and what was there and what wasn't, and they couldn't reconcile what taxes had been paid versus the inventory there. And evidently, I don't know if it's still the same, but at the time there, if taxes hadn't been paid, you can't legally sell it. So the government sent a team in and they started dumping the rest of the whiskey into tankers, and they smashed up all the empty bottles and containers. The tanked whiskey was taken to New Jersey and processed into ethanol for fuel. So they took all that aged whiskey and literally just processed it into fuel. So it's it's terrible. It's absolute travesty, to be honest with you. Let me see where I'm at here. I'm going to go through a little more history, then we're going to hit these two one more time, and then I'll finish out here. So in 1996, so we're fast forwarding a little bit, 96, an attorney friend of David Beam contacted him about the old Michters distillery grounds in Pennsylvania. She had just purchased it, and she wanted him to survey the property, basically. Hey, what do I have? What's there? What's not? During the survey, he found out a couple of things. One, that Vendome pot still was still intact and was actually in good shape. So he made a plan later that year with Larry Walker, Donnie Ritchie, and David's three sons. They drove to Pennsylvania and they pulled that old pot still out of the distillery. And for 15 years, he literally just stored it in his garage. Like it just sat in his garage. There's pictures of it in his garage, which is actually less of a garage and more of like a big shed. If you look at the pictures, it just sat there for 15 years. In 2010, he sold the still to Tom Hurstruck, who started a distillery in Chagrin Falls. I don't know if I'm saying that right or not, Bob, but Chagrin Falls, Ohio, where he was going to make Applejack. That distillery is now known as Tom's Foolery Distillery.
Yep.
So Tom's Foolery originally had the Vendome pot still from Michters and made their Applejack. And actually, Dave Beam and Dick Stoll both went up to his distillery and taught him how to use that still and run the pot still. So here again, Dick Stoll in retirement comes out of the woodwork along with David Beam, and they taught Tom and that crew how to distill their Applejack on that pot still. So in same year, a little bit later in 96, Joe Magliocco and Dick Newman found an old abandoned bourbon trademark called Michters. And what's odd is in Joe's college days, he actually sold Michters. I didn't know that. I've heard podcasts with him and so forth. I either missed it, glazed over, didn't know it. But yeah, he actually sold Michters, which is part of the reason I looked it up and wanted to buy it. They purchased it for $245. Like probably the best investment ever, right? And technically, it was owned by his export and import company, Chatham Imports. So now they had the label. They needed to find whiskey to source. So from 97 to 99, they basically went around and went to a large amount of the Kentucky distilleries. They started sampling and looking for whiskey to buy and bottle. They settled on United Distillers product, which basically was Bernheim, although there's some rumor that some of their early stuff was actually Stitzel-Weller as well as Bernheim. It's Michters has always been very, very close mouth on where they source from and so forth. But at the time, United Distillers owned Stitzel-Weller and owned the Bernheim, which was I.W. Harper for the most part. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a mix of both, but at the minimum, we know it's Bernheim for sure. And at this time, they reached out and created a business deal with Julian Van Winkle to bottle and label their product at Lawrenceburg Distillery, which is again Hoffman. So it's kind of it's a weird circle that's come around where the A.H. Hearst, some of the A.H. Hearst well-aged stuff. So if we go back to the A.H. Hearst, what they were famous for were the 20 plus year bottlings of A.H. Hearst. There were 8-year bottlings out there, and that was the 550 barrels that were tanked after 8 years. So that's not aging any longer. It can only be 8 years. That was, I would say, is probably really good whiskey. But what they were, what their claim to fame were, and the whiskey that all of the bourbon reviewers and everyone went crazy over, was this whiskey they took to Hoffman and they just continued aging at the Hoffman distillery, which ended up becoming the over 20-year product that 99 rating, 100 rating, best whiskey you'll never taste kind of thing. So full circle, some of the original Michters from Joe and his group ended up being bottled by Julian Van Winkle at, again, Hoffman. So if anybody has any old Michters bottles, I'm going to give you a little bit of decoding here to see if you've got a treasure, or if you're ever dealing with someone and they've got bottles of Michters, ask them to take a snapshot of the neck tag. So the first bottlings were the first Michters 10-year bottles at 10-year rye. So the first bottles They didn't come out with, US 1 till later, their bourbon and their standard rye. It was Michter's 10-year rye, Michter's 10-year bourbon. These bottles, the age ranged anywhere from 10-year to 16 to 19 years. So much like what happened in the 80s and 90s, called the whiskey glut, for lack of better terms. Age statements may say it's a 12-year, a 10-year, an 8-year, a 6-year, whatever it may be. But in reality, it's got a large portion of higher age stock than that. Obviously, they're required by law to only state the age of the youngest whiskey. They believe a large portion of these early Michter's 10-year bourbon and rye that came from Bernheim and maybe Stitzelweller were anywhere from, a large portion was 16 to 19 years. The back label, so two things to look at. The back label would be documented. It was bottled in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. That's the first thing you want to look for. If you've got a really old bottle of Michters, look on the back and say, and if it says bottled in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, you've got one of these first bottles. A neck label will have a single or 2-digit number and a letter. So let's say a 10A or a 116 or whatever the case may be, or a A16 or whatever. Nowadays, the bottles have more of a date code type of neck tag to them. So when you're taking a look at that, if you really have an old bottle or someone's wanting to trade you an old bottle, take a look. If you run into one of these, they're absolutely gold mine if you can find one. In 2002, we know that the Van Winkles moved to Buffalo Trace. So Michters basically found a new bottling partner at Willett. And these bottles will say bottled in Bardstown. These are mostly known to be Heaven Hill stock, but they also could have some Old Forester, Bernheim, or Seagrams in there as well. So again, another option that's a little bit later in life, 2002 range. If you see any that say bottled in Bardstown, they're going to be Willett / KBD bottled, and they're going to be from a variety of places, but mainly well-aged Heaven Hill. And at that point, it would be pre-fire. They're bottling in 2002, and it's 10 years plus. In 2004, Michters came to an agreement with an undisclosed Kentucky distillery to distill Michters for a few days per year. In the early years, it was suspected this came from Brown-Forman at the Early Times Distillery. And Fred Minnick kind of sort of let that slip in an article or interview a few years later after that. I think he got in a little bit of trouble for it. I would say it's probably pretty safe to say. I also would be surprised if what they're doing today isn't still currently Brown-Forman distilled, but there's no proof of that I know of. In 2011, they purchased the old Caldwell Industries building in Shively in Louisville area. And under the guidance of Willie Pratt, so there's another legend that comes into play, they basically transformed the site to their new distilling operation. From 2012 to 15, none of their distillate went to a barrel. They only produced White Dog and sampled, refined, sample, refined, sample, refined, sample, refined. They were both trying to perfect the distilling, obviously. And what they were really doing, they were waiting for their brand new column stills, what they were really doing. So they were kind of biding some time and trying to perfect their craft while they were waiting for the new column still. The distillery completed and started production in 2015. It's not open to tours. However, in 2011, they purchased an old building in downtown Louisville. It was called the Fort Nelson Building. It probably should have been taken down, but very similar to what Castle and Key did at the Oak Taylor Distillery, they decided to keep the history of the building and the bones, and they went into an 8-year, $8 million renovation. That obviously today is the Fort Nelson Distillery downtown. But interesting, kind of bring it full circle. The pot still that came from the old Michter Distillery, it was in David Beam's garage, and it was in production at Tom Foolery, was purchased by Joe, and it currently sits at Fort Nelson Distillery downtown. If anybody's been there, you've probably seen it. They opened their door in 2019, and basically that it is technically a functional distillery. It's very similar to the Evan Williams experience. It's not a high volume production distillery by any means. It's really there to be the tour and guest experience, for lack of better terms.
Like the original Michters, by the way, with the visitor distillery. I mean, so the concept comes all the way back around, which is very cool. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And just as a kind of odd note, and I don't know if it'll change with the changing ownerships, but they currently contract, warehouse, and age some of their products in Green River and Owensboro. So that's just a little piece of tidbit there. So I don't know if that'll change going forward or not, but that is quite lengthy history that I could come up with for Michters.
Yeah. I mean, a couple things, you know, I got to meet the great Dick Stoll and hang out with him for a whole day talking about distilling. Went up there with Royce Neely, drove up to Pennsylvania, the two of us, a road trip that really kind of life-changing if you're into doing what I do. And, you know, and I've maintained a friendship with Dick up until his death and still talk to, you know, his wife. And of course, you know, Stolen Wolf is a distillery now. He was brought back out of retirement. You know, one thing that Wes didn't mention is, you know, he did some work in concrete, but he also spent the bulk of his post distilling career as a janitor in a grade school, which is to me, again, just a real shame. There was no distilleries left in Pennsylvania, so he couldn't get any distilling work. So, you know, he did what he needed to do to, you know, to finish out his careers. But, you know, just amazing to think that this great distiller, that might have made the greatest whiskey that's ever been made, according to certain people, you know, couldn't find a job in distilling after, you know, after Michter's closed. So very, very sad, but very cool in that Eric Wolf, a young guy who decided he wanted to open a distillery, was really into history of Pennsylvania distilling and started researching it. And the name Dick Stoll keeps coming up. And he finds out, lo and behold, here's a guy that's still alive in his 80s at that time. And they partner up and they actually go and make some whiskey. Which is kind of cool because they actually went and made it at a friend of ours' place at Silverback Distillery in Afton, Virginia. So I don't know how they landed on Silverback. I have no idea how that relationship came about, but they went down there. Dick Stoll made whiskey for the first time. I don't know. It's getting close to 8, 9 years ago, 10 years ago now. But yeah, that was really a cool thing that, yes, they did that. Another piece of trivia from the Michter's years for Charles Everett Beam. There should be some familiar taste if you make the whiskey, if you could ever find any of that whiskey West going back to his time distilling, in that he used Beam yeast. So you think about proprietary yeast, and Beam yeast being one of the most famous ones. He would go home to Louisville, and he would you know, go down to Bardstown and get some of the that Beam yeast because he was a family member, one of the 7 sons. You hear about the 7 Beam sons.
Yep.
He was one of those, so he's a family member. He'd go down and get it, and he'd take it up to Michters where he was plying his trade. So that's kind of a cool thing too. And A.H. Hirsch, you didn't mention this, but he really had no plans of starting a brand or anything like that. He wanted to keep that industry alive when they were struggling and getting ready to go bankrupt. One of the times, of course, they had multiple times, went through bankruptcy several times, but to provide them a cash infusion, he ordered those 800 barrels with no intention of ever starting a brand. He just wanted to give a local business that he wanted to keep an industry around in. You know, he just placed an order. So ultimately, and he kept it there till literally they were getting, you know, shuttered the doors. So yeah, really, really interesting aspect of that.
Yeah, I appreciate the tidbits on that. I kind of struggled when I was going through this. I was trying to, the event is about the Michter's history, and I was trying not to make it super Dick Stoll heavy, and I was trying to like keep it there. When I dug into it, I was like, there's so much, it's a 230-year history of this company. It becomes a point where it could be a 3-hour event if we really like branch off and get into Dick Stoll history and Charles Beam history and A.H. Hirsch history. And so I tried to get the high points of that and try to stick to as much as I could. So I appreciate that added info in there.
Yeah. He really worked with Royce, continued to mentor him. Like I said, from the time we went to visit till his death, open communication, going back and forth. Royce designed a yeast room based on plans that Dick Stoll drew out on a napkin when we were there, showed him how to do it and how it was operated. And Royce didn't know how to propagate and keep yeast alive, how you do that. And he showed him on the thing how to do that. ultimately, his wife liked to joke that that's a guy who couldn't use an iPad to send an email, couldn't do any of that stuff. But he literally knew how to do everything to run a distillery, even after he hadn't been involved in distilling for years and years and years. He remembered everything about Michters that had closed in 1990, and we're meeting with him in 2017, 2018, whatever that was. And he remembered, what the pH level was you had to get to the whiskey, and all these different things that really helped Royce out a lot. And I think that was one of the big moments in his career, is going up and spending that day with Dick Stoll. So the coolest thing for us is we spend this whole day, we record the whole thing, which we would always decide. Royce says someday he wants to put that in his yeast room on the tour, where it's Dick Stoll talking about yeast and just on a continuous loop, just playing that. But that's pretty cool. But the coolest moment for us was we get done with all this and he's like, "Hey, you guys want to go out to dinner?" And we were like, "What? Out to dinner with Dick Stoll?" And what was cool was he didn't go to a fancy place. He went to the place that he liked to go to, the all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. And we got to go to his favorite place and hang out and just talk to him. Again, very casual. And it's just one of the greatest moments in my whiskey journey, for sure, was spending a day with Dick Stoll. So, yeah, it was cool.
All right. Well, does anybody have any last comments on either sample A or B, or you guys think you're ready to vote and figure out which is which?
All right. As they say on Survivor, it's now time to vote. Wes usually runs through and picks who has to vote when. And again, you're going to be voting on two things. Which one you think is the Dusty? You can get that one wrong. The second one you cannot get wrong. It is, what is your favorite of the evening? That is a question you can't get wrong, because you like what you like.
Steve, you ready to tally the votes there? Steve?
I'm ready, buddy.
All right, we're going to start with, is Bob there? Bob Whitlatch, or is he gone? I think he's gone. We'll give him a chance to get back. Let's start with Brian Murphy.
His camera's still on, but he's not there.
Yep. So first of all, A is my favorite. And I'm gonna say A is the Dusty. Just because it feels like it should be.
Okay.
And B, I'm not sure. but I'm gonna go with A for both my favorite and the Dusty.
Okay. Let's go Kent Mace.
Not fair. I was still tasting. I'm just going to agree with Brian.
Okay.
On everything.
A and A. Okay.
A.
Let's go Jason Whipple.
I'm double A as well.
Double A. Interesting. Let's go to Robert Mace.
I too, double A.
Double A.
Go double A. All right, Tom.
Yeah, I'm gonna. A is definitely my favorite, but it's probably the Dusty too. I'll go A and A.
A and A.
All right. Let's go to Mr. Bill, who's drinking out of a big red Pizza Hut cup.
And I keep going back and forth. A is definitely my favorite.
Okay.
I'm gonna go B. I think
B is the Dusty. Okay. All right.
I like it. I think we finally found one that actually has people stumped a little bit, so I like it. Let's go to Nate Mace.
Give me AA, and I'm not talking Alcoholics Anonymous. Am I right, guys?
Let's go to the Robinsons. We'll go with ladies first. We'll go with Melanie.
All right, double A.
Go double A. Let's see if Neil's sleeping on the couch or he agrees.
A for both for me.
All right, there you go. Let's go Tony Frund.
I'm gonna go A for my favorite, but B for the Dusty.
Okay. Jason Souter.
He's the Dusty. A's my favorite.
Did you say B was the Dusty?
Yep.
Okay. Let's go with Mike Gascamp.
I'm gonna go double A.
Double A.
MCO.
Let's go to the E-wall. Let's go to Adina first, please.
I've got to go double A also.
Uh-oh. All right, Dave.
I'm going A is my favorite and B is the Dusty.
Uh-oh, house divided. I love it.
Yep.
Well, Bob is not on, so Bob, are you there? We'll give him one more shot here. I don't physically see him on there, so I'm guessing he's not there.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to him.
All right. So Steve, what's the
Well, what, Tom, you got Tom first, right? Tom, you didn't vote, did you?
No, I think I got Tom.
You did? Okay. Well, I got to vote, right?
Yeah, you got to vote.
I'm going to be the only one that does this. B and B. I think it's B and B.
B and B.
B was my favorite. B was my favorite, and B I think is the Dusty. So
Wrong.
we'll see. We'll see. It's pretty slam dunk for A won 10-5, thinking that it's the Dusty. They did get 5 votes, and then on the favorite it was 14-1. So I was the only one who said B was my favorite, and I also said it was the Dusty. So there you go.
So you were the only one that said B was your favorite?
Yeah, I was the only one.
That's interesting. Okay. Well, let me get my handy notes out here. What was the final tally? 14-1. What was the Dusty?
10-5. 10-5.
10-5A.
Yeah.
All right. So in this particular outing, the Dusty is A.
Oof. Ouch.
They were to me, they were probably as close as any event that I've had that I can remember anyway.
Yeah, Wes, I think the only one tighter was the Crown.
But yeah, the Crown was pretty
Crown was pretty
consistent for
tough.
sure. Yeah, I think that's probably a result of the blending more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Which of the modern days is it?
Again.
I'm sorry, I had 2 questions there. What were they?
So Dave's number 2 again.
What'd you say, Jason?
And then what was the modern day bottle?
It's just Michter's small batch US1. Yeah. It's like a 91.4 proof, which is an odd proof. So the only real difference in the two, obviously the current Michters is source. It doesn't come from Pennsylvania at all, and definitely doesn't come from the exact same mash bill or anything else. And the proof was 86 versus 91, so it's pretty close, 5 proof points. What I thought though, from a proof standpoint, I didn't think that either one of them really outshined the other one from a proof standpoint. So it was interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
They're both good. That A holds up well.
Mm-hmm.
Tastes fresh to me, man.
It does.
It's good.
Got a beautiful finish.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just seems more flavorful and complex.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say that, it's 77. It's right in the early towards the middle of the whiskey downfall, and even though they claim that they only ran the pot still, and really they only ran the pot still for visitors only into the 80s. So my guess is what we're tasting tonight is probably some of that combination of that dual column still pot still.
Yeah.
And it's probably why it's a little bit unique and a little bit more modern for something back in the 70s.
Yeah. That's cool.
That would be my guess anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, great job as always. Let's hear from Mr. Wes Hardin for bringing it, man. A lot of history there. Really, really cool stuff. So yeah, I love hearing about Michters, and yeah, that great historic brand, and obviously so much great history in Pennsylvania that's largely forgotten. So good to kind of resurrect that and talk about that. Very cool. So on that note, we will say goodbye. Wes and I will stick around as we like to do here, answer any questions or things like that. But for our at-home audience, we'll say goodbye for now. See you guys.
See you, everyone. Thank you.